Attention, please. We need to start now. If you don't mind, obviously. Because I'm only one and you're too many. So, few of you have been here before. So you have heard me talk about Nietzsche on many occasions on different subjects, of different parts of his philosophy. But tonight I decided to bring something new, something that is very interesting, it's very controversial, and something actually that prompted me to choose the topic of my PhD dissertation, which argued actually that Nietzsche was not understood properly, especially in his critical first book, The Birth of Tragedy, written in 1872, in which Nietzsche tries to justify life. There are many scholars who actually believe that Nietzsche simply copied Schopenhauer's pessimism in The Birth of Tragedy, which cannot be further from the truth. And this is the world of academia, where colleagues don't want to argue against each other. They would rather be quiet. But I was never one like those. So I found a big gap, big mistake in a major scholarship approach when it comes to Nietzsche, especially The Birth of Tragedy. And I focused on a particular philosopher called Julian Young, and his book published in 1992 called Nietzsche's Philosophy of Art, in which he actually misses the target by a mile. And fascinating that nobody saw that. So I was the first one to actually argue against that, and I managed to do that successfully. And this is the topic of my PhD dissertation. So if you're interested in that, you can find it on academia.edu. If you put my name there, there are many different things that I published there. Among others is the dissertation called The World as an Aesthetic Phenomenon, the Foundation of Nietzsche's Ethics. Most people, when they hear the name Nietzsche, they think of a philosopher of pessimism. They think about somebody who was a nihilist, a dark philosopher, somebody who accepted suffering, somebody who looked at the abyss, somebody who propounded rejection of all moral values. So everything that the world, that religions, Christianity especially, valued highly, Nietzsche actually refused. He denounced it, and he asked for creation of new values. So it's understandable that most people actually see in him the philosopher of pessimism, something which is negative rather than something which is positive. But this is exactly what I argue, and this is what I'm going to argue tonight, and actually present to you as well the same argument, because for me this is the biggest understanding of Nietzsche's scholarship, as I mentioned, and especially the first book, The Birth of Tragedy. Before we start going more into detail, I need to remind you that Nietzsche is not an egalitarian philosopher. Nietzsche is not a communist. Nietzsche is not a socialist. Nietzsche is not a religious philosopher. So he is not egalitarian. He talks about, especially in The Birth of Tragedy, he talks about more nobly formed natures. This is a big aspect that many scholars have actually miss to remember and also to understand, which is even more important. So Nietzsche mentions who are those more nobly formed natures. Later on, that develops into something else which he calls Übermensch or overman. So this is the metaphor of all these people who have devoted their lives for achieving the greatest goals possible. People like Goethe, Beethoven, also he mentions Caesar, and obviously himself. He is the one who says that about himself, rightly. So why are these people over men? Why Zarathustra says that man is only a rope between an ape and Übermensch? This is a terrible responsibility if you understand life or humanity as such. That We need to move from that ape into something higher, but we are right in the middle now. Now the question is, even the end of 19th century, the question is, are we doing that? Or we are still in that middle, maybe even more ape than Übermensch. Nietzsche cries loudly, tries to wake up the world. In every single book of his, he does the same thing. He's talking about that optimization of all life forces, all drives that every single human possesses. And still, because of that, he is understood as pessimist. This is unacceptable. This is very optimistic view of life. But it's not something that just belongs to that nobly formed natures, an Übermensch. It belongs to everyone. Nietzsche never said that that is not going to happen. Nietzsche asked for commitment, for passion, for hardship, for embracing of suffering, not avoiding suffering, but embracing it and using it as a platform from which one will be able to justify, hence affirm life. But optimizing one's nature is not an easy job. And this is why most people would rather not do that. I will go much deeper into that, because I also wrote another book in which I argue about my understanding of life and what it means to be human. For me, I have mentioned that a few times, but we will talk about it a bit later, and you will see interesting similarities with Nietzsche. So once again, Nietzsche is not an egalitarian philosopher. It's very important to understand. But everything that he advises, everything that he talks about, is to be understood as signpost for humanity, the guidance, not only for few people, but for everyone. Now it's up to us. Are we going to accept that and try to affirm life, to maybe trying to be the best that we can be, or we will reject that and embrace pessimism and enjoy our comfortable lives in liberal democracy, for example, living in any state that you don't have to do anything about yourself. Everything will be taken care of. Everything. That happened already in history and collapsed. In communism, for example. Communism tried to be the first big nanny-state, and it didn't work. Because people don't want to be treated as babies. There are a lot of people who want to be treated differently. And this is what Nietzsche talks about. And this Übermensch and nobly formed natures and everything that he offers in The Birth of Tragedy especially should be understood as a signpost for humanity, for better us. And now it's entirely up to anybody, everybody, which way you will go. That way or another way. Humanity has proven that other way, pessimism, is more attractive, simply because it's easy. You don't have to do anything. This is why religions are so popular. Mosques are full on Friday, Sunday, churches are full. Millions of people around the world go there. When I do philosophy talk, look how many people come. There are those millions. So you are coming here, you are obviously looking for something a little bit more than which is offered on the plate, for free. But whatever is given for free, obviously, has no value. It never had, and it never will. Now, The Birth of Tragedy was heavily influenced by Arthur Schopenhauer. Nietzsche was influenced anyway, and he says that many times, the great Arthur Schopenhauer, my only teacher, he says. He learned from Schopenhauer so much. But being influenced doesn't mean that you can only, and you will only learn and accept something from someone. Being influenced also means that you will be criticizing that someone, in Nietzsche's case, for the rest of his life. So if you criticize somebody for the rest of your life, you have obviously been influenced by that particular philosopher tremendously. And this is what happens with Nietzsche. So young Nietzsche walks into the second-hand bookstore and comes by accident across the book which is called World as Will and Representation, the famous work by Arthur Schopenhauer. So Nietzsche takes that book, goes home, and he says, when I opened that book, I was simply nailed to my sofa and I couldn't move for days because every sentence, every thought, every idea that I read in that book were simply everything that I always felt and I always thought. To see how impressive that book was, what tremendous impact that book had on Nietzsche, young Nietzsche. And this is a stroke of luck, actually, because to come across such a book when you're a young man and to absorb that book in a particular way is blessing. Now, what was so impressive about Schopenhauer? So Schopenhauer, first of all, denounced God. For Schopenhauer, God doesn't exist. So what is the essence of the world if there is no God? So Schopenhauer sees as the essence of the God of the world blind and purposeless striving, which he calls the will. And he says wherever you look, you see that will materialized or objectified in organic and non-organic nature. So everything that exists is manifestation, is objectification of the will. Now, more complex creatures come out in the world, which are organic beings, like, for example, trees, grass, then you have birds, then you have animals, then you have apes, then you have humans. So they are all objectification of that will. But humans are the highest form of objectification of that will. And only through humans, will can actually recognize itself. But there is a problem. And the problem is that Schopenhauer also called that will to life, or will to live. And that drives humanity into something that he calls principium individuationis, or principle of individuation. What that means? That means in the world of, in the phenomenal world of existence, as you can see around yourself, people, individuals, everybody is me. And me is very important because I have my house, and these are my children, this is my wife, this is my car. So I want to be somebody who has things, and they're all mine. But the problem is that everybody thinks like that. And therefore everybody is everybody's obstacle, in a way, of achieving more of this mine. So that principle of individuation is a trouble. Also for Schopenhauer, we are in the constant state of suffering. Now this is important as well for Nietzsche. We constantly suffer. Why? Because we are constantly willing, we are constantly desiring. And desire is nothing but a state of lack. When you desire something, you desire it because you don't have it. So you're suffering. But what about happiness? What happens when we actually fulfill our desire? Well, Schopenhauer says we enter the state of boredom. Once satisfaction is there, once we have fulfilled our desire, we get bored. And what happens? The new desire pops out. And we go again, and again, and again. And this is how we spend all our lives. Actually constantly being in that state of suffering. So because suffering is ineluctable, ubiquitous, what is the point of life? And Schopenhauer comes with the conclusion that the world has a moral meaning. And that moral meaning is actually that life is not worth living. And this is, in a nutshell, is much more than that, but in a nutshell, this is the essence of Schopenhauer's philosophy and his view. Nietzsche agrees with Schopenhauer's descriptive aspect of suffering. Yes, suffering is there, is present, is unavoidable, is constantly around us, but he doesn't agree with Schopenhauer's evaluation of suffering. That suffering is bad for us and we have to avoid suffering by all means. So how do we avoid suffering through Schopenhauer? Simply by renouncing our desires. We extinguish our desires, starting with sexual desire and every other desire. And we actually end up in that Buddhistic nihilism in which there is no desires, no suffering, and off you go. Eventually you reach the state of nothingness known as nirvana. Nietzsche doesn't agree with that. Yes, he says, you're right, suffering is there, I accept that, the descriptive aspect is fully accepted, but with evaluation I don't agree. So for Nietzsche, suffering is necessary, but it's not a bad thing. Suffering actually is a challenge for Nietzsche. And he wants us to understand that suffering and use it as a platform from which we will be able to actually justify life. So how are we going to do that? Nietzsche says humans don't mind suffering. Humans always suffered. Just look at the history of the world. There are a lot of people who suffered, who died actually in the war. Why? Because they had a meaning of suffering. The problem is when suffering is meaningless, then you have a problem. But athletes, they suffer. When they compete in competitions, there's no pleasure, there's constant suffering. But they do it willingly. They don't mind suffering because they're looking for achievement. Their suffering has meaning. So Nietzsche realizes that actually suffering should be looked upon through the different lens. And this is how Nietzsche arrives to Attic tragedy. Now, for Schopenhauer, tragedy is the best proof that actually life is not worth living. Because when you go and you watch Sophocles' tragedy, Antigone, or you watch Oedipus Rex, you actually realize that despite all this naivety and justice, there is still suffering, and suffering constantly prevails, says Schopenhauer. And taking from Aristotle, who actually said that tragedy is the pinnacle of art, because in tragedy we get finally that catharsis. We get rid of that feeling of fear and pity, because we experience that in the tragedy, and we actually free ourselves from that. And this is the great effect of tragedy, according to Aristotle. Schopenhauer takes that and very similarly actually speaks about the same thing. Yes, we go and we see in the tragedy that actually life is not worth living, because despite all the heroic attempts in every single tragedy, and despite them being right, being just, they end up dying, they end up suffering. So for Schopenhauer, tragedy is simply the proof that life is not worth living. Nietzsche sees tragedy from a very different prism. In order to explain the nature of tragedy, as he sees Attic tragedy, Nietzsche uses two Greek gods, Dionysus and Apollo, as metaphors for passion, for frenzy, sexual frenzy, for intoxication, and also Apollo, who is the god, actually metaphor of measure, beauty, dream state, equilibrium. So now we have two different deities which play the essential role in Greek tragedy. You see how complicated tragedy is. It's not just to go there and see what's happening there and understand the story. But if you try to understand tragedy as Nietzsche is proposing, that turns into the pinnacle of art, in real pinnacle of art. So where is now Dionysus in the tragedy? Dionysus is in the form of music, the chorus of satires. There is always music in tragedy. And in the Attic tragedy, that chorus was constantly singing, drumming, constantly injecting the rhythm, the music into the event. Apollonian part of the tragedy is actually in the lyrics, in the story, in the plot, in the acting. Language is involved there. Language is very important for Nietzsche as well. He devoted a whole paper of that, The Truths and Lies in Non-Moral Sense, also published, written in 1872, but never published. So you have language from one side, you have the plot, you have reason, you have understanding, explanation, description, and on the other side you have music. So why tragedy needed both of them? Nietzsche says the following: that music literally takes us completely. We succumb to the Dionysian element, and we enter into Dionysian world of intoxication. Via music, we get in touch with eternal being, with primeval mother of everything. We see that under phenomenal world, there is an underlying eternal current of life. Life is in general, of all of life, of all humans. And we understand that actually we are part of that life, that eternal undercurrent. And this is possible via music. Again, this is taken from Schopenhauer. And we are so immersed into that impression of eternal life that we don't want to get out of it. And Nietzsche says in The Birth of Tragedy, individual gets shattered into pieces. When individual gets into that state of that intoxication, fully immersed into the Dionysian element, and he doesn't want to go back. So psychologically, we are done, we are finished. But what happens? Because of the Apollonian element, because of the lyrics, the plot, Apollo literally pulls us out of that state and brings us back to the world of individuation. Complicated, isn't it? So what is the difference now? We went, we saw something, we came back, but we are not the same anymore. Because despite our individual sufferings, individual problems, despite of our phenomenal everyday issues, we have understood that we are part of something much deeper, much bigger, something which is eternal. And we start living differently. All of a sudden, everything that was so problematic is not anymore. Now we are relieved. And we can start living finally free. Free of those clutches of individuation. We spoke before about few philosophers, when I said they are not really original. And this is the heart of existentialism. See, when you get out of the clutches of individuation, you look at the world differently. You're very empowered. And tragedy offers you that. Now, how is it possible that Greeks discovered this? Why did they invent the tragedy? Well, Nietzsche says the following. He introduces the god of the forest, Silenus, who was the Dionysus' companion. And legend goes that King Midas wanted to hunt Silenus, who was a half satyr, because Silenus was Dionysus' companion, and he knew things. And Midas wanted to hunt him and force him to tell to King Midas, what is the best thing that I can do in life? But they couldn't get him. Finally, they got him. And when they got him, Midas looked at him and says, I want you to tell me what is the best thing that we can do. Silenus looked at him and said, "O miserable ephemeral race, children of accident and suffering, why you are asking me to tell you something that you never want to hear? The best thing to do is never to be born, is not to be. And the second best is to die soon." So that's the message. Now, why is Nietzsche bringing us this? Because Greeks knew this. This is Greek mythology. So Greeks were not some naive optimists. Greeks knew the suffering of life. They knew wars, they knew diseases, they knew death. But they didn't succumb to pessimism as Schopenhauer did, or Christianity did. So what did they do? They invented Delphic gods. They invented gods to position gods between that worldly, unavoidable, omnipresent suffering and life. So gods were created in the likes of humans. But more importantly, it wasn't one god. There were many, there were 12. And this is another thing very important, that Nietzsche says that the only theodicy worth considering was polytheism. Why? Because we are all different. We are different characters, different desires. The bottom line is we are different. We are not the same. And now what polytheism offers? Offers different gods. Offers anybody to find his own God and live in peace with that God. And basically polytheism offers everybody to be right, not wrong. So if you are, for example, if you are a warrior, your God would be Ares. If you are a poet, your God would be Apollo. If you are a lawmaker, your goddess will be Athena. If you are a sailor, your god would be Poseidon. And this is the beautiful thing, beautifully explained nature of polytheism. Because every character was right and had the right to develop itself. As Nietzsche wants to, every individual to create his own values. Now what has happened? With the emergence of monotheistic religions, polytheism was destroyed and one God was invented. Now you have the same set of moral values for everybody, regardless of your nature, regardless of your character. Either you like it or don't, you have to follow. That's it. So for majority of people, this set of moral values was right. But there were people who didn't agree with it. Nietzsche was one of them. And this is why he actually goes back to Greek mythology and Greek philosophy and feeds himself with the ideas of Greek philosophy and mythology. So why was Nietzsche misunderstood? Because one of the leading scholars of Nietzsche, Julian Jung, quoted in his book that Nietzsche, in Nietzsche's philosophy of art, that Nietzsche didn't do anything with the birth of tragedy apart from replicating Schopenhauer's pessimism. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Because Birth of Tragedy is not a pessimistic book. Birth of Tragedy is actually optimistic book. Because Nietzsche wants to justify life. And justifying life cannot be pessimistic book. And he says, only as an aesthetic phenomenon, the world and existence, read life, can eternally be justified. Only as an aesthetic phenomenon. Not moral phenomenon. Because morally, rationally, epistemically, the world could not be justified. Christianity didn't justify the world. Schopenhauer didn't justify the world. They all tried morally, epistemically. So only as an aesthetic phenomenon. How are we going to do that? By implementing Apollonian and Dionysian arts. An illusion is an essential part of our aesthetic experience. Now, Julian Jung argues that by implementing illusion, first Apollonian illusion, and then Dionysian illusion, Nietzsche simply rejects the reality, he says. Because if you face the reality as it is, you have no other option but to understand the world as Arthur Schopenhauer did. And he adds even more insult to the story by saying that Schopenhauerian pessimism was more humanly than Nietzsche's attempt to justify life in the Birth of Tragedy. And I obviously didn't agree with that. So I have proven him wrong, very much so. And the important issue with illusion is that Julian Jung says that because it's not epistemically justified, it cannot be accepted as justified. Life has to be justified epistemically, rationally. But just think about human life. Is it only the rational side of us that matters? Rational side is enough for scientific discoveries. Science helps us to understand how the world works. But what about issues in life which actually define us more than our reason, our scientific understanding of objects and world and stars and celestial objects? What about issues like love, friendship, faith? You can go further. Courage, fear, hope. Are these things not part of our lives? Or maybe these things are even more important part of our lives. Love, friendship. What is that? How that works with reason, an epistemic warranty of justification? It doesn't. What about art? Museums. People are flocking. I went to see Van Gogh's exhibition recently, a few months ago. Thousands of people there every single day. Sunday, Monday, Saturday, doesn't matter. Why are people going to museums? Why they want to see art? What is real in that? Nothing is real. Nothing is real. You look at Van Gogh's shoes. What is real about them? Nothing. Starry Night. What is real there? Nothing. So why you want to see that? What about symphonies? Why do you want to listen to something which is nothing? Why people die for love? Write about love. What is love? Can we measure it? Grams, kilograms, meters, centimeters, inches, whatever. And this is the issue, this is the problem with the thinkers who really acknowledge only our rational side and ignore the other side. Now the question is, how much of each side everybody has? There are people who are more rational than intuitive, passionate. There are people who are more passionate. So nobody before Nietzsche has ever tackled this issue. No philosopher has ever entered these murky waters of human nature as Nietzsche did. Apart from actually one, and this is Dostoevsky. And funny enough, they lived both at the same time, but they didn't know much about each other. Dostoevsky never learned about Nietzsche, and Nietzsche learned about Dostoevsky very late in his life, and he was very upset about it. And then he said, I learned so much from Dostoevsky, but I think if he lived in Jesus' time, they should have lived in the same street. Because Nietzsche had a very high view of Jesus. Not Christianity, but Jesus. I can speculate that the reason for that is actually Dostoevsky's explanation of Jesus in the Brothers Karamazov in book 5, chapter 5, called Grand Inquisitor. But this is a separate subject, and I think I gave a lecture on that subject as well. So, love, friendship, hope, art, music, they all implicitly have in themselves illusion. Love cannot be explained rationally. Friendship cannot be explained rationally. Because if you try to be rational in love or friendship, you are going to fail before you start. And this is the problem. So that need for epistemic warranty in order to justify something, in this case life, for me is absolutely unacceptable, because it does ignore illusion as an essential part of human life. And proofs are all around us. Sculptures, paintings, architecture, music. Brilliantly explained in Schopenhauer's Aesthetics. Probably the most beautiful aesthetic explanation ever done. So I think I had enough time, and I managed to tell you the most important issues about this topic tonight, why Nietzsche was misunderstood by many. I didn't mention bad interpretations of Nietzsche, like during the Nazi time. They actually had Nietzsche's statues on stadiums because they use Nietzsche as a national hero, as the leader, as the ideological guru, if you want, of Nazism, which is appalling. I mean, imagine who did it. These are people who obviously didn't understand anything when it comes down to understanding Nietzsche's philosophy, because Übermensch, an overman, wasn't somebody who was ruling others or molesting others, not to mention killing or abusing others. But Übermensch is somebody who has power over himself. That's Übermensch. Übermensch was Goethe. Beethoven was Übermensch. Nietzsche was Übermensch. Not Goebbels, not Hitler and the Acronists. But, however, even because of that, for decades, Nietzsche was completely neglected and rejected as a philosopher, especially in English-speaking universities. And they started finally recognizing their mistake in the 60s and introduced Nietzsche back to philosophical curriculums. And here we are now to discuss, was Nietzsche right or was he wrong, as scholars suggest. Thank you.